They handed me a gas station receipt and told me that was all my husband left behind. No inheritance, no savings, no future for our 3 children, just debt and a trailer that smelled like cigarettes and broken dreams. But when Marcus walked through my front door 6 months later, identical to my dead husband except for the kindness in his eyes, everything I thought I knew about my life shattered like glass. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Zelma Brooks, and I'm 43 years old. Though most days I feel like I've lived twice that long. I worked as a night shift security guard at Riverside Medical Center for 8 years, the kind of job where you learn to sleep with one eye open and trust nobody completely. My husband Eddie had been gone for 6 months when this story really began, and I was still wearing his wedding ring on a chain around my neck because I couldn't bear to take it off my finger just yet. Eddie Brooks died on a Tuesday morning in March, clutching his chest in our kitchen while I was getting the kids ready for school. By the time the paramedics arrived, he was already gone, and my world had collapsed into a series of phone calls, paperwork, and people telling me how sorry they were for my loss. What nobody told me was how quickly sorry turns into impatience when there are bills to pay and arrangements to make. The funeral director was the first person to mention money. He sat across from me in his carpeted office that smelled like air freshener and sadness, explaining payment plans for caskets I couldn't afford. Eddie had always handled our finances, and I'd been too tired from working nights and raising 3 kids to pay attention to the details. I trusted him completely, the way you trust someone you've been married to for 15 years. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, sliding a manila folder across his desk, "I'm afraid there seems to be some confusion about your husband's life insurance policy. According to our records, the policy lapsed about 2 years ago." I stared at him, my brain struggling to process the words. That couldn't be right. Eddie had told me just last Christmas that everything was taken care of, that if anything happened to him, we'd be fine. I called the insurance company from the funeral home parking lot, sitting in my dented Honda Civic while the kids waited in the back seat, unusually quiet for 8, 12, and 14-year-olds. The customer service representative confirmed what the funeral director had said. The policy had been canceled for non-payment in November 2 years prior. There had been multiple notices sent to our address, all of which apparently went unanswered. That was the first crack in the foundation of everything I thought I knew about my husband. Over the next week, more cracks appeared. The bank informed me that our joint savings account, which I believed contained about $12,000, actually held $347.63. Our checking account was overdrawn. The credit cards I didn't even know existed were maxed out. Eddie's brother Michael, who lived 3 states away and worked in pharmaceutical sales, showed up for the funeral wearing an expensive suit and an expression that suggested he was doing us all a tremendous favor by being there. He had Eddie's face but none of his warmth, and when he spoke to me, it was with the kind of condescending patience people use when they think you're not very bright. After the service, Michael cornered me near the cemetery gates, while relatives I barely knew picked over the leftover sandwiches in the church basement. "Zelma," he said, his voice artificially gentle, "I know this is hard, but we need to talk about Eddie's affair. I've been going through some of his papers, and I'm afraid the situation is worse than you probably realize." He pulled out a folder thick with documents I'd never seen before. Business loan applications with Eddie's signature all denied. Credit card statements showing charges for things like electronics and motorcycle parts, none of which I could account for in our home. Bank statements from accounts I didn't know existed, all showing negative balances or closure due to insufficient funds. "It looks like Eddie was in pretty deep financial trouble," Michael continued, not meeting my eyes. "I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but there's really nothing left. The house has a second mortgage on it that you probably don't know about. The cars are both financed beyond their value. Even his tools and equipment, everything has liens against it." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. What about his business? Eddie had been an independent contractor, doing electrical work for small businesses and residential clients. He'd always talked about building something we could pass down to the kids. Michael shook his head. "More debt than assets, I'm afraid." His clients are owed refunds for work that was never completed. There are outstanding bills to supplier. The business checking account was closed last year for overdraft fees. Standing there in my black dress that I'd borrowed from my sister, holding a wilted carnation from Eddie's casket spray, I realized that my husband had been living a completely different life than the one I thought we shared. Either that, or someone was lying to me. At the time I couldn't imagine why Michael would lie about something so devastating, so I accepted his version of events as true. The weeks that followed were a blur of phone calls from creditors, notices taped to our front door, and long conversations with a bankruptcy attorney, who explained my options in the kind of clinical detail that made me feel like I was drowning in paperwork. My oldest daughter Kaylee started doing her homework in the school library because she was embarrassed to bring friends home. My middle child Trevor became quiet and withdrawn, spending hours in his room playing video games on a console that would probably be repossessed soon. My youngest, Stella, was too young to understand why mommy cried every time someone knocked on the door. I took on extra shifts at the hospital, working 60-hour weeks and sleeping 4 hours a night when I was lucky. The security job paid $14 an hour, which had been manageable when Eddie was bringing in money, but was nowhere near enough to cover our mortgage, utilities, groceries, and the minimum payments on debts I was only now discovering. Michael called every few weeks to check on us, always with the same tone of concerned authority that made me feel like a child being managed by a responsible adult. He suggested I sell the house quickly before the foreclosure process started. He recommended a lawyer friend of his, who specialized in bankruptcy cases. He even offered to help me find a smaller place to rent, somewhere more appropriate for our reduced circumstances. Everything he said made sense, but something about his helpfulness felt wrong. Maybe it was the way he never looked directly at me when he talked, or the way he seemed to have all the answers ready before I asked the questions. Or maybe it was just that he looked so much like Eddie that talking to him felt like having a conversation with a stranger wearing my husband's face. 3 months after the funeral, I was packing boxes in our bedroom when I found Eddie's old cell phone wedged between the mattress and the box spring. I'd been looking everywhere for it, hoping to find contact information for some of his clients who still owed money. The phone was dead, and when I plugged it in to charge, I realized I didn't know his passcode. I tried our anniversary date, my birthday, the kids' birthdays, even his mother's maiden name. Nothing worked. I was about to give up when I remembered something Eddie used to say when he was feeling nostalgic. He'd talk about his childhood dog, a golden retriever named Buster who had died when Eddie was 12. He'd loved that dog more than anything in the world, and sometimes when he'd had a few beers, he'd tell the kids stories about the adventures they'd had together. I typed in Buster 1985, the year the dog died, and the phone unlocked. What I found there changed everything I thought I knew about my husband's final months. Text messages with clients who were praising his work and asking when he could start their next projects. Bank deposit confirmations for amounts that were much larger than what Michael had shown me. Photos of completed electrical jobs that looked professional and substantial. Email threads about a commercial contract that would have brought in nearly $40,000 over 6 months. This wasn't the phone of a man whose business was failing. This was the phone of someone who was actually doing quite well for himself. I scrolled through Eddie's contacts until I found a name I recognized: Tony Castellano, the owner of Castellano's Restaurant, a local Italian place where Eddie had done some rewiring work the previous summer. I called Tony from the hospital during my break, not sure what I was hoping to learn. "Mrs. Brooks," Tony said, his voice warm with recognition. "I'm so sorry about Eddie. He was a good man, and he did beautiful work for us. I hope you got the check we sent. We wanted to pay his final invoice right away. Didn't want you to have to chase us down during such a difficult time." "What check?" I asked, my heart starting to race. "The one we sent to his business address about a week after the funeral. $4,700 for the kitchen renovation he finished right before he passed. We sent it certified mail to make sure it got to the right place." I thanked Tony and hung up with shaking hands. There had been no check for $4,000. In fact, Michael had specifically told me that Tony's restaurant still owed money to Eddie's estate. Money that we'd never be able to collect because the work had been substandard, and the client was disputing the charges. That night, instead of trying to sleep before my shift, I sat at our kitchen table with Eddie's phone and started calling every client contact I could find. One by one, they told me the same story. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Eddie had completed their work satisfactorily. They had paid promptly. Several mentioned sending final payments to his business address after his death, wanting to make sure his family received what was owed, but I had never seen a single one of those checks. Eddie's business address, according to the clients, was a P.O. box at a Mail Plus location about 20 minutes from our house. I drove there the next morning, still wearing my security uniform from the overnight shift. The teenager behind the counter was helpful but not particularly interested in my story. He looked up the box number and confirmed that it was registered to Brooks Electrical Services, with monthly payments current through the end of the year. The box had been paid for 6 months in advance. He told me right around the time of Eddie's death. Someone had been collecting mail from it regularly, at least twice a week according to their access logs. I asked if he could tell me who had access to the box. He shook his head. Privacy policy. But he did tell me that the person authorized to collect mail was not the same person who had originally rented the box. The box had been rented by Edward Brooks, but the authorization for mail pickup had been transferred to Michael Brooks about 2 weeks after Eddie's funeral. I sat in my car in the Mail Plus parking lot for 20 minutes, trying to make sense of what I'd learned. Michael had been collecting Eddie's business mail, including final payment checks from clients, without telling me. He had told me that Eddie's business was failing and that clients were refusing to pay, when in reality they had been sending money that Michael was intercepting. But why would he do that? What possible reason could he have for lying to me about Eddie's finance? That afternoon, I called the law office that Michael had recommended for my bankruptcy case. I told the receptionist that I was Mrs. Brooks, and that I needed to speak with Mr. Henderson about my husband's estate. She transferred me immediately. Mrs. Brooks, Miss Henderson said, "I was just about to call you. We've finished reviewing all the documentation that Michael provided, and I have to say, this is one of the more straightforward cases I've seen. Your husband really did leave quite a mess behind him. But the good news is that most of the debt can be discharged, and you'll be able to start fresh." "What documentation?" I asked. "The financial records that Michael brought in last week, bank statements, loan documents, business record, everything we need to establish the extent of the debt and the lack of assets." Michael was very thorough. I had never given Michael permission to take Eddie's financial records to a lawyer. In fact, I had never seen most of the documents that the lawyer was describing. But somehow Michael had been able to provide detailed financial information about my husband's affairs to an attorney, information that painted a picture of failure and debt that didn't match what I was discovering on Eddie's phone. That evening, I called my sister Joyce and asked her to watch the kids. I told her I had some errands to run, but what I really needed was time to think without interruption. I drove to the diner where Eddie and I used to go for late breakfast after his early morning jobs, and I sat in our usual booth with a cup of coffee and his phone, trying to piece together the timeline of what had happened. Eddie died on March 15th. Michael arrived for the funeral on March 20th. By March 22nd, he had convinced me that Eddie died broke and in debt. By the end of March, he had transferred access to Eddie's business mail to himself and had taken financial documents to a bankruptcy lawyer. He had also recommended that I sell the house quickly and had put me in touch with a real estate agent who specialized in distressed sales. Everything had happened so fast that I hadn't had time to question any of it. I'd been grieving and overwhelmed, and Michael had presented himself as the responsible family member who was stepping in to help. But now I was beginning to wonder if he was actually the family member who was stepping in to steal. I opened Eddie's email on his phone and started scrolling through his messages from the last few months before he died. What I found there made my blood run cold. Eddie had been planning to update his will. There were multiple emails with a lawyer named Patricia Vaughn, discussing changes to his estate plan. The last email was dated just 4 days before Eddie's death, and it included a message that made my hands shake as I read it. "Miss Vaughn," Eddie had written, "thank you for preparing the new will as we discussed. I'll be in your office Monday morning to sign everything. I want to make sure Zelma and the kids are protected, especially given what I've learned about Michael's financial problem. As we talked about, I'm removing him as executor and making Zelma the sole beneficiary of everything, including the business and the investment accounts. I know this is the right decision. I stared at the email for a long time, reading it over and over again. Eddie had been planning to change his will the Monday after he died. He had been planning to remove Michael as executor. He had mentioned investment accounts that I'd never heard of, and business assets that Michael claimed didn't exist. And most importantly, he had mentioned Michael's financial problems. What financial problems? Michael presented himself as successful and stable, the responsible brother who was helping his broke sister-in-law navigate her dire circumstances. But according to this email, Eddie had been concerned enough about Michael's finances that he was removing him from his will entirely. I paid for my coffee and drove straight to Patricia Vaughn's law office. It was nearly 8 o'clock at night, but I could see lights on in some of the windows. I sat in the parking lot until I saw a woman in a business suit leaving through the side door. I got out of my car and approached her, hoping she might be the lawyer who had been working with Eddie. "Excuse me," I said. "Are you Patricia Vaughn?" She stopped and looked at me with the wariness of someone who had been approached by strangers in parking lots before. "Yes. Can I help you? I'm Zelma Brooks. I think my husband was working with you on updating his will before he died." Her expression changed immediately. "Miss Brooks," she said, her voice full of concern, "I've been trying to reach you for months. I have Eddie's will, the new one he was supposed to sign the day after he passed away. When I heard about his death, I tried calling the number he gave me, but it had been disconnected. The number Eddie had given her was his business line, the one that Michael had canceled along with everything else he claimed was worthless. Patricia Vaughn had been trying to contact me about a will that Michael had told me didn't exist. She invited me into her office, and what she showed me there turned my understanding of my situation completely upside down. Eddie had indeed been planning to update his will, and the new version was dramatically different from the old one that Michael had used for the estate proceeding. In the original will, which had been written 8 years earlier, Michael was named as executor and secondary beneficiary after me and the children. But in the new will that Eddie had planned to sign, I was the sole executor and the children and I were the only beneficiary. More importantly, the new will included a detailed inventory of assets that Michael had claimed didn't exist, a business savings account with nearly $30,000, investment accounts with Eddie's construction union that were worth close to $60,000, life insurance policies through his professional association that were current and in good standing. Even the house had been paid down more than Michael had indicated, with only about $40,000 remaining on the mortgage. According to the asset list that Eddie had prepared for his new will, his estate was worth close to $200,000, not counting the ongoing value of his business client relationships and equipment. Mrs. Vaughn was clearly uncomfortable about the situation. She explained that without Eddie's signature, the new will wasn't valid, and legally the old will remained in effect. But she was concerned about discrepancies between what Eddie had told her about his assets and what had apparently been reported to the court during the estate proceeding. I asked her if she had copies of the documents that had been filed with the court, the ones that Michael had submitted. She made some phone calls and was able to obtain copies of the estate filing that evening. When we compared those documents to the asset list Eddie had prepared, it was clear that someone had systematically underreported or hidden nearly every valuable asset Eddie owned. The business account that Eddie listed as containing $30,000 was reported to the court as having been closed for insufficient funds. The investment accounts were listed as dissolved prior to death. The life insurance policies were marked as lapsed due to non-payment. Even Eddie's truck, which was worth at least $15,000 and was paid off, was listed as financed beyond value. Someone had deliberately and methodically erased Eddie's assets from his estate, and that someone had to be Mike. He was the only person who had access to Eddie's papers, the only one who had been in contact with lawyers and courts, the only one who knew enough about the estate to manipulate the documentation. I drove home that night with copies of both wills and a head full of questions I didn't know how to answer. If Michael had been stealing from Eddie's estate, why? He had a good job and seemed financially stable. What could he possibly need the money for badly enough to steal from his dead brother's wife and children? The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. Instead of going to the hospital, I spent the day making phone calls and trying to track down the assets that Eddie had listed in his planned will. The business savings account turned out to be real and active, with a balance of just over $28,000. But the account had been frozen shortly after Eddie's death, and only the executor of the estate had authority to access it. Michael, as executor, had filed paperwork claiming the account was empty, and had requested that it be closed with any remaining funds transferred to cover estate expenses. The bank representative I spoke with couldn't give me details over the phone, but she was able to confirm that the account had contained a substantial sum at the time of Eddie's death. The investment accounts were harder to track down, but with Patricia Vaughn's help, I was able to contact the Union Benefits Office. Eddie's accounts were indeed active and valuable, but someone claiming to be the estate executor had submitted paperwork requesting that the funds be liquidated and sent to an address I didn't recognize. The union representative was suspicious enough about the request that they had held off on processing it, but they had been planning to complete the transfer soon. I asked them to freeze any action on the accounts until I could sort out the legal situation. They agreed, but warned me that they couldn't hold things indefinitely without proper court documentation. By the end of the day, I had confirmed that nearly every asset Eddie had planned to include in his new will actually existed and was substantially more valuable than Michael had reported. I had also discovered that Michael had been actively working to liquidate or transfer those assets, using his authority as executor to move money that should have been coming to me and the children. But I still didn't understand why he was doing it, and I didn't know how to stop him without proof that would hold up in court. That night, I sat down with the kids and tried to explain that things might not be as bad as we'd thought. Kaylee, who was smart enough to have been worrying about money since the funeral, asked pointed questions about where the money had been and why we were just finding out about it now. I didn't have good answers for her, but I promised that I was going to figure everything out. Trevor, my quiet middle child, surprised me by asking if Uncle Michael had been lying to us. I told him I didn't know yet, but that I was investigating. Stella, who was only 8, just wanted to know if we were still going to have to move out of our house. I told her I hoped not, but that I couldn't make any promises until I understood the situation better. The kids went to bed that night with more hope than they'd had in months, and I stayed up until dawn reading through every document Patricia Vaughn had given me, trying to understand the legal process Michael had used to hide Eddie's assets, and figuring out how to prove what he'd done. What I needed was evidence that Michael had knowingly submitted false information to the court, bank records showing the real balances in Eddie's accounts, documentation of the asset transfers Michael had authorized, proof that he had been collecting mail and money that belonged to the estate without reporting it. But getting that evidence was going to require legal help that I couldn't afford, and time I didn't have. Michael's next move would probably be to speed up the bankruptcy process and the house sale, getting everything finalized before I could challenge the estate filing. I needed to act fast, but I didn't know. That's when I remembered something Eddie had told me years earlier, back when we were first married and he was sharing stories about his childhood. He'd mentioned that Michael was adopted, taken in by the Brooks family when his own parents died in a car accident. But he'd also mentioned something else that I'd forgotten until now. Michael had a twin brother, Marcus. Michael had a twin brother named Marcus, who had also been adopted by the Brooks family, but who had gone to live with different relatives when the boys were teenagers. Eddie had lost touch with Marcus over the years, but he'd mentioned him occasionally, usually when he was talking about family dynamics or childhood memories. I wondered if Marcus knew what Michael was doing. I wondered if he cared. And I wondered if he might be willing to help me figure out how to prove that his twin brother was systematically stealing from his adopted brother's estate. Finding Marcus turned out to be easier than I expected. A quick internet search revealed that Marcus Brooks lived about 6 hours away in Tennessee, where he worked as a financial advisor for a firm that specialized in estate planning and asset protection. The irony was almost too much to believe. I called his office the next morning and asked to speak with him about a family matter. His assistant was polite but protective, explaining that Mr. Brooks was in meetings all day. I left my name and number and a message saying that I was Eddie Brooks' widow and that I needed to speak with him about Michael. Marcus called me back within 2 hours. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, his voice immediately familiar but somehow warmer than Michael's. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Eddie was a good man, and I should have reached out sooner. I've been meaning to call, but to be honest, I wasn't sure if Michael had told you that I existed." He had the same voice as Eddie and Michael, but there was something different about his tone. Less guarded, more direct. When I explained that I needed to talk to him about some concerns I had regarding the estate, he didn't hesitate. "I can drive up there this weekend," he said. "There are some things about Michael that you probably need to know, and some things about Eddie's finances that I think you're going to want to hear." The way he said it made my stomach tighten. Marcus knew something about Michael that I did, and whatever it was serious enough that he was willing to drive 6 hours to tell me about it in person. I spent the rest of the week preparing for Marcus's visit. I organized all the documents Patricia Vaughn had given me, printed copies of the bank statements and emails I'd found on Eddie's phone, and made a timeline of everything that had happened since Eddie's death. I wanted to be ready to show Marcus exactly what I'd discovered, and to get his perspective on whether my suspicions about Michael were justified. The kids were curious about why Uncle Michael's twin brother was coming to visit. I'd never mentioned Marcus to them before, partly because I'd forgotten he existed, and partly because Eddie had rarely talked about that side of the family. I explained that Marcus was their father's brother-in-law, sort of, and that he was coming to help us understand some things about their dad's business. Kaylee, who was developing the kind of skepticism that comes from watching adults lie to children about money problems, asked if Marcus was going to tell us we were broke too. I told her I hoped not, but that we were going to listen to what he had to say and make our own decisions about what to believe. Saturday morning came gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that makes everything feel more serious than it probably needs to. I was cleaning the kitchen when I heard a car door slam in the driveway. I looked out the window and saw a man who looked exactly like Eddie walking toward my front door, carrying a briefcase and wearing the expression of someone who was not looking forward to the conversation he was about to have. When I opened the door, the resemblance was so strong that for a moment I forgot how to breathe. Marcus had Eddie's face, Eddie's build, Eddie's way of standing with his hands in his pocket. But when he spoke, when he looked directly at me with concern and attention, I could tell immediately that this was not the same person as Michael. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Marcus. Thank you for reaching out to me. I think it's time we talk." Marcus stepped into my living room, and immediately I could see him taking inventory of our situation. His eyes moved from the stack of unpaid bills on the coffee table to the boxes packed with items we were planning to sell, to the worn furniture that had seen better days. But unlike Michael, who had looked at our circumstances with what I now realized was calculated sympathy, Marcus looked genuinely concerned. He sat down on our old couch and opened his briefcase with the efficiency of someone who dealt with complicated family financial situations for a living. "I'm going to be direct with you, Mrs. Brooks," he said, "because I think you've been lied to enough already. Michael called me about 3 weeks after Eddie's funeral. He told me that Eddie had died broke, and that you were struggling with massive debt. He said the family was rallying around to help you through bankruptcy, and that everything was being handled properly." I felt my chest tighten. "That's essentially what he told me too." Marcus nodded grimly, but Michael also asked me something else. He wanted to know if I remembered Eddie ever mentioning any investment accounts or business savings that might not be in his regular bank. He said the lawyers needed to make sure they'd found everything before filing the estate paperwork. My heart started racing. "What did you tell him?" I told him the truth, that Eddie had called me about 6 months before he died, asking for advice about setting up some investment accounts through his union. Eddie was worried about making sure you and the kids would be okay if something happened to him. He wanted to build up assets that would be protected and easy for you to access. Marcus pulled out a yellow legal pad covered with handwritten notes. Eddie specifically asked me about vehicles for hiding assets from creditors, not because he was planning to defraud anyone, but because he'd heard stories about families losing everything to medical debt or business liability issues. He was being careful, trying to protect his family's future. I stared at Marcus, pieces of the puzzle starting to click into place in my mind. So Eddie did have protected assets. According to what he told me, yes, substantial ones. He'd been systematically moving money into accounts that would be harder for creditors to touch, and he was planning to update his will to make sure you knew about everything. Marcus looked up from his notes and met my eyes directly. The Eddie I talked to 6 months ago was not a man who was struggling financially. He was a man who was planning for his family's security. I pulled out the copies of documents that Patricia Vaughn had given me and spread them across the coffee table. This is what I've been able to find so far, I said. Marcus spent the next hour reviewing everything I'd discovered, asking detailed questions about the timeline of Michael's involvement and the discrepancies between what Eddie had planned and what had been reported to the court. When he finished reading, Marcus sat back and rubbed his forehead in a gesture that reminded me painfully of Eddie. Mrs. Brooks, I need to tell you something about Michael that might help explain what's happening here. Michael has been having serious financial problems for the past 2 years. Not just tight money or temporary setbacks. Serious problems. What kind of problems? Marcus hesitated, and I could see him weighing how much to tell me. Michael got involved in some high-risk investments about 3 years ago. Cryptocurrency, foreign exchange trading, some partnership deals that went bad. He lost most of his savings and ended up borrowing heavily to try to recover his losses. I thought about Michael's expensive suit at the funeral, his confident manner, the way he'd presented himself as the stable, responsible family member. You mean he's been lying about his financial situation? Not just lying about it, desperately trying to hide it. Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled through what looked like a series of text messages. Michael has been borrowing money from family members, telling each of us different stories about why he needs it. He borrowed $15,000 from our cousin Janet, telling her it was for medical expenses. He got $20,000 from our Uncle Robert, claiming it was for a business opportunity. My mouth went dry. How much money are we talking about? From what I've been able to piece together, Michael owes at least $150,000 to various family members, not counting what he probably owes to banks and credit card companies. He's been robbing Peter to pay Paul for months, and the whole thing was about to collapse. And then Eddie died, I said, quietly, understanding beginning to dawn on me. Marcus nodded, and suddenly Michael had access to an estate with substantial assets, along with a grieving widow who was too overwhelmed to ask detailed questions about the financial details. I felt sick to my stomach. You think he's been stealing from Eddie's estate to pay his own debts? I think that's exactly what he's been doing, and I think he was counting on you being too devastated and too trusting to figure it out before he could liquidate everything and disappear. We sat in silence for a few minutes while I tried to process what Marcus had told me. Everything about Michael's behavior since Eddie's death made sense now. His eagerness to handle all the financial details, his insistence that I shouldn't worry about complicated legal matters, his recommendations for lawyers and real estate agents who would expedite the process of selling our asset. But understanding what Michael had done was different from being able to prove it, and proving it was different from being able to stop it. I asked Marcus what he thought our options were. That depends on how much evidence we can gather and how quickly we can move. Marcus opened his briefcase again and pulled out a thick folder. I've been doing some research since you called, and I've identified several irregularities in the estate filing that should be enough to get a court's attention. He showed me documents that he'd obtained through his professional connections, bank records that contradicted what Michael had reported to the court, and a detailed analysis of the asset transfers that Michael had authorized. The evidence was compelling, but Marcus warned me that Michael would likely try to accelerate his timeline once he realized that someone was investigating. We need to move fast, he said, and we need to be prepared for Michael to fight back. He's not going to just admit what he's done and return the money. He's going to try to discredit you, claim that you're emotionally unstable or that you're misunderstanding the situation. I thought about my children upstairs, probably listening to our conversation and wondering if their lives were about to change again. What do you think we should do? First, we need to freeze all the estate assets that Michael hasn't liquidated yet. I can help you file emergency motions to stop any pending transfers and to remove Michael as executor. That will buy us time to investigate further and gather more evidence. Marcus explained that the legal process would be complicated and potentially expensive, but that we had a strong case if we could demonstrate that Michael had deliberately misrepresented the estate's assets. He also warned me that going after Michael legally would probably destroy any remaining family relationships. I've already lost my husband, I told him, and according to what you're telling me, Michael was never really family anyway. He was just someone waiting for an opportunity to steal from us. Marcus studied my face carefully. Are you sure you want to do this? Once we start this process, there's no going back. Michael will know that you're onto him, and he'll do whatever he can to protect himself. I looked around our living room, at the boxes of belongings we'd been preparing to sell, at the bills piled on the coffee table, at the evidence of a life that had been systematically dismantled by someone I'd trusted. My children deserved the security that Eddie had worked to provide for them. I deserved the truth about what my husband had actually left behind. Yes, I said, I want to do this. Marcus nodded and started making notes about our next step. We spent the rest of the afternoon planning our strategy, identifying which assets we needed to protect first and which legal motions would be most effective. By the time he left that evening, I had a clear understanding of what we were up against and what we needed to do to fight back. The next morning, I called Patricia Vaughn and explained what Marcus and I had discovered. She was shocked by the scope of Michael's deception, but agreed to represent me in challenging the estate proceeding. She warned me that the legal fees could be substantial, but she was willing to work on a contingency basis if we could recover enough assets to justify her time. That afternoon, Patricia filed emergency motions to freeze Eddie's business account and investment funds, and to suspend Michael's authority as executor pending an investigation into the accuracy of the estate filing. The court granted temporary relief, which meant that Michael could no longer access or transfer any of the remaining assets until there was a hearing on the matter. Michael called me that evening, and for the first time since Eddie's funeral, he sounded genuinely angry rather than condescendingly sympathetic. Zelma, he said, his voice tight with controlled fury, I just got a call from my lawyer. Apparently you've filed some kind of complaint against me with the court. I have to say I'm deeply hurt that you would question my handling of Eddie's affairs when I've been trying to help you through an incredibly difficult situation. I took a deep breath and tried to keep my voice steady. Michael, I've discovered that Eddie had assets that weren't included in the estate filing, substantial assets. I think there's been some kind of mistake and I need to make sure that everything is accounted for properly. There was a long pause before Michael responded. Zelma, I understand that you're grieving, and that this has been overwhelming for you, but I need you to understand that what you're doing could have serious consequences. You're making accusations that could damage my reputation and my career. You're also going to incur legal expenses that you can't afford, chasing after assets that simply don't exist. His tone was measured, but there was something underneath it that I'd never heard before, a kind of cold calculation that made me realize how little I actually knew about my brother-in-law. I found Eddie's phone, I said quietly. I know about the clients who paid their final invoices. I know about the business account and the investment funds. I know that you've been collecting mail from his business address without telling me. Another long pause. Then Michael's voice, much colder now. Zelma, I think you're confused about a lot of things. Grief can do that to people. It can make them see patterns and conspiracies that don't actually exist. I strongly recommend that you drop this investigation before you embarrass yourself and waste money you don't have on a legal process that's only going to confirm what I've already told you. He hung up before I could respond, and I sat in my kitchen holding the phone and trying to process the conversation. The Michael I'd just talked to was completely different from the caring, concerned brother-in-law who had been so helpful after Eddie's funeral. This Michael was threatening and manipulative, and he was clearly worried about what I might discover. Over the next few days, I learned more about the scope of Michael's deception. With Patricia's help, I was able to subpoena bank records that showed exactly how he'd been systematically draining Eddie's accounts. The business savings account had contained $31,000 at the time of Eddie's death. Michael had withdrawn the money in 3 installments over 6 weeks, claiming that it was needed to pay estate expenses and outstanding debts, but there was no documentation showing what those expenses were or which debts had been paid. The money had simply been transferred to accounts controlled by Michael and then moved again to accounts I couldn't trace. The investment accounts were an even more brazen theft. Michael had submitted forged documents to the Union Benefits Office, claiming that Eddie had authorized the liquidation of his accounts before his death. The forgery was sophisticated but not perfect, and a handwriting expert was able to confirm that the signatures were not Eddie. Marcus drove up from Tennessee again the following weekend, this time bringing additional documentation that he'd gathered about Michael's financial situation. He'd been in contact with other family members who had loaned money to Michael, and the pattern of deception was even worse than we'd initially thought. Michael had been telling elaborate lies to different relatives, spinning stories about business opportunities, medical emergencies, and temporary cash flow problems. He'd borrowed money from at least 7 different family members over the past 2 years, always with promises to pay it back quickly and always with excuses when the payback dates came and went. More importantly, Marcus had discovered that Michael had been planning to declare bankruptcy himself, probably within the next few months. He'd been liquidating assets and moving money to accounts that would be protected from creditors, and he'd been consulting with bankruptcy attorneys about the best strategies for preserving as much wealth as possible while discharging his debt. Eddie's estate had represented an unexpected windfall for Michael, a chance to solve his financial problems without having to admit to his family that he'd lost everything through bad investments and poor decisions. But the most disturbing thing Marcus showed me was a series of emails between Michael and a private investigator that he'd hired to research my background and financial situation. Michael had been systematically gathering information about my income, my debts, my credit history, and my psychological state following Eddie's death. The emails made it clear that Michael had been planning his deception for weeks before he even arrived for Eddie's funeral. He'd known exactly how much money Eddie had, and he'd developed a detailed strategy for convincing me that the money didn't exist while he quietly transferred it to accounts he controlled. One email in particular made my blood run cold. In it, Michael instructed the private investigator to look for any evidence of mental health issues or substance abuse problems that could be used to challenge my credibility if I ever questioned the estate proceedings. He'd been preparing to destroy my reputation if I got too close to discovering his theft. Armed with this new evidence, Patricia was able to file additional motions, requesting a full investigation of Michael's handling of the estate, and asking the court to remove him as executor immediately rather than waiting for the scheduled hearing. She also filed a motion requesting that the court order Michael to provide a full accounting of all estate funds he'd accessed, along with documentation showing how the money had been spent. The court granted both motions, which meant that Michael was officially removed as executor and that he was required to provide detailed financial records within 30 days or face contempt of court charges. Michael's response was swift and vicious. Within a week of the court order, I started receiving calls from creditors claiming that Eddie had owed them substantial amounts of money. A medical equipment company claimed that Eddie had purchased several $1,000s worth of supplies that were never paid for. A tool supplier insisted that Eddie had outstanding invoices dating back 6 months. When I asked for documentation of these debts, the amounts and details kept changing. It became clear that Michael was manufacturing fake creditor claims in an attempt to reduce the apparent value of the estate and to justify his earlier liquidation of assets. But Marcus and Patricia were ready for this strategy. As a financial advisor, Marcus knew how to trace money movements and identify fraudulent documentation. Patricia had experience with family members who attempted to hide assets during estate proceedings. Together, they were able to demonstrate that most of the creditor claims were either completely fabricated or grossly inflated. The most telling evidence came when we investigated the companies that were claiming Eddie owed them money. Several of the businesses had been incorporated within the past month, after the court had frozen the estate assets. Others had addresses that led to empty office buildings or mail forwarding services. Michael had created an elaborate web of fake companies and false invoices in an attempt to make it look like Eddie's estate was actually in debt rather than profitable. It was a sophisticated fraud scheme, but it was also desperate and sloppy in places where Michael had been forced to work quickly. During this time, I was still working my security job at the hospital, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy for the kids while dealing with the legal proceeding. The stress was enormous, and there were nights when I lay awake wondering if I was doing the right thing by pursuing Michael so aggressively. The kids knew something major was happening, but I tried to shield them from the worst detail. I explained that there had been some confusion about their father's financial affairs, and that we were working with lawyers to get everything sorted out. Kaylee, who was sharp enough to read between the lines, asked if Uncle Michael had been stealing from. I told her that we didn't know for sure yet, but that we were investigating some irregularities. Trevor wanted to know if we were going to have to move after all, and Stella just wanted assurance that everything was going to be okay. I couldn't promise them that everything would be okay, because I genuinely didn't know how the legal proceedings would turn out. But I could promise them that I was fighting for the security that their father had wanted them to have, and that I wasn't going to let anyone take advantage of our family. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks after Patricia filed the initial motions, and as the date approached, Michael's behavior became increasingly erratic. He started showing up at my workplace, cornering me in the hospital parking lot and trying to convince me to drop the legal proceedings. During one particularly uncomfortable encounter, Michael grabbed my arm and told me that I was making a serious mistake by trusting Marcus. He claimed that Marcus was manipulating me for his own financial gain, and that I was being used in some kind of scheme to discredit Michael's reputation. "You don't understand the family dynamics here, Selma," Michael said, his grip on my arm tighter than it needed to be. "Marcus has always been jealous of my success, and he's using Eddie's death as an opportunity to settle old scores. You're going to end up with nothing, and Marcus is going to disappear with whatever assets actually exist." I pulled my arm free and told Michael that if he contacted me again outside of legal proceedings, I would file for a restraining order. His mask of concerned helpfulness had completely dropped by then, and the person standing in front of me was clearly capable of much worse behavior than financial fraud. That night, I called Marcus and told him about the encounter. He wasn't surprised by Michael's accusations, but he was concerned about the physical intimidation. "That's not like Michael," Marcus said. "He's always been manipulative, but he's not usually physically aggressive. The fact that he's escalating to that level suggests that he's more desperate than we realized." Marcus recommended that I document any future encounters with Michael and that I consider asking for police protection if the harassment continued. He also suggested that we accelerate our timeline for the hearing, since Michael's behavior suggested that he might be planning something more dramatic than just legal maneuvering. The following week, Patricia received a call from Michael's attorney requesting a meeting to discuss a possible settlement. Michael was apparently willing to admit that there had been some accounting errors in the estate filing, and was prepared to make adjustments to correct the discrepancy. Patricia and I met with Michael and his lawyer in a conference room that felt like a battlefield. Michael looked haggard and stressed, completely different from the confident man who had taken charge of Eddie's affairs 6 months earlier. His lawyer, a sharp-dressed woman who clearly specialized in white-collar defense, did most of the talking. They were proposing that Michael return about $60,000 to the estate, which they characterized as funds that had been improperly distributed due to clerical errors and miscommunication. In exchange, I would agree to drop all legal proceedings and accept Michael's revised accounting of the estate assets. It was a lowball offer that represented maybe a third of what we believed Michael had actually stolen, and it came with no admission of wrongdoing or fraud. Patricia advised me to reject it, but she wanted me to understand that going to trial was expensive and risky, with no guarantee that we'd be able to recover everything even if we won. I looked across the table at Michael, who was staring down at his hands and refusing to make eye contact. This was the man who had hugged me at Eddie's funeral and promised to take care of everything. This was the person who had convinced me that my husband died broke while he systematically stole the money Eddie had saved for his children's future. "No," I said clearly. "We're not accepting any settlement that doesn't include full restitution and an acknowledgement of what actually happened here." Michael's lawyer tried to negotiate, warning me about the costs and uncertainties of litigation, but I was done being intimidated by people who thought I was too naive or too grief-stricken to fight for what was right. After we left the meeting, Patricia told me that she was proud of my decision but that I needed to be prepared for Michael to escalate his tactics. Settlement offers usually came when people were worried about what a trial might reveal, and Michael clearly had more to hide than we'd discovered so far. She was right. Over the next 2 weeks, the fake creditor claims became more aggressive, with people calling the house at all hours demanding payment for debts that Eddie had supposedly incurred. Someone broke into my car in the hospital parking lot, though nothing was stolen. I started getting hang-up calls in the middle of the night. The harassment was clearly designed to make me feel unsafe and to pressure me into accepting a settlement. But it also confirmed that Michael was worried about what we might find if the case went to trial. Marcus drove up again the weekend before the hearing, and this time he brought something that changed everything we thought we knew about the case. He'd been digging deeper into Michael's background and had discovered something that explained why Michael had been so desperate for money, and why he'd been willing to risk everything to steal from Eddie's estate. Michael wasn't just in debt from bad investments. He was being investigated by the SEC for securities fraud related to his work in pharmaceutical sales. He'd been using insider information to make trades in medical device companies, and federal investigators had been building a case against him for the past year. If Michael was convicted of federal securities fraud, he would face substantial fines and possible prison time. More importantly, he would lose his professional licenses and his ability to work in the financial services industry. He'd been looking at the complete destruction of his career and his ability to earn a living. Eddie's estate had represented more than just a way to pay off Michael's debts. It had been his only chance to accumulate enough money to survive a federal conviction and the loss of his career. This information put Michael's behavior in a completely different context. He hadn't just been stealing from his dead brother's family out of greed or desperation. He'd been preparing for the likelihood that his entire professional life was about to collapse, and he'd been willing to destroy us to save himself. Armed with this new understanding, Patricia was able to present a much stronger case at the hearing. We weren't just dealing with estate fraud. We were dealing with someone who was facing federal criminal charges, and who had systematically looted his brother's assets to prepare for his own legal troubles. The judge was clearly disturbed by the scope of Michael's deception and by the evidence of ongoing harassment and intimidation. He ordered an immediate audit of all estate transactions and appointed an independent administrator to take control of any remaining assets while the investigation continued. More importantly, he issued a restraining order preventing Michael from contacting me or my children directly, and he referred the case to the district attorney's office for possible criminal charges related to the forged documents and fraudulent creditor claims. Walking out of the courthouse that day, I felt like I could breathe properly for the first time since Eddie's death. We hadn't recovered the stolen money yet, and the legal process was far from over. But for the first time, I felt like someone in authority understood what had been done to my family and was taking it seriously. Marcus walked me to my car and told me that he was proud of how I'd handled everything. You could have just accepted Michael's version of events and tried to move on with your life, he said. A lot of people would have done that rather than fighting a battle they weren't sure they could win. I thought about Eddie, about the conversations we'd had about the future, and about making sure the kids would be okay if something happened to him. He'd worked hard to build something for us, and he'd trusted his family to protect what he'd built. Eddie deserved better than this, I said, and my children deserve the security he tried to provide for them. Marcus nodded. Michael betrayed more than just your trust. He betrayed everything Eddie believed about family and loyalty. But you've shown that there are still people willing to fight for what's right, even when it's difficult. The drive home that evening felt different than any trip I'd made in months. For the first time since Eddie's death, I felt like I had some control over my family's future. The legal process wasn't over, and there would undoubtedly be more challenges ahead. But I was no longer the overwhelmed widow being managed by people who claimed to know what was best for me. I was someone who had uncovered the truth and was fighting for justice, and that felt like something Eddie would have been proud of. The restraining order against Michael gave me the first peaceful night's sleep I'd had in months, but I knew it was just the beginning of a much longer battle. The independent administrator appointed by the court, a stern woman named Dr. Elizabeth Chen, who specialized in forensic accounting, called me the morning after the hearing to schedule our first meeting. Dr. Chen's office was located in a glass building downtown that made me feel underdressed in my thrift store blazer and department store shoes. But when she greeted me in her reception area, I could tell immediately that she was someone who cared more about substance than appearances. She was probably in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen every possible variation of financial deception. "Mrs. Brooks," she said as we settled into her conference room, "I've been reviewing the preliminary documentation from your case, and I have to say that what your brother-in-law did was both sophisticated and brazen. We're looking at a minimum of 6 separate fraudulent transactions, possibly more depending on what we find when we dig deeper." She spread out a timeline she'd created showing Michael's activities from the day of Eddie's death through the court hearing. The scope of his deception was even worse than I'd realized. He'd been moving money, forging documents, and creating false paper trails, almost from the moment Eddie was pronounced dead. The business account liquidation was just the tip of the iceberg, Dr. Chen explained. Your husband had also set up several certificate of deposit accounts that matured at different times over the past year. Michael managed to cash out 3 of them by forging power of attorney documents that he backdated to before your husband's death. I stared at the timeline, trying to process the level of planning and calculation that Michael's theft had required. This wasn't desperation or panic. This was systematic criminal behavior carried out over months, while he pretended to comfort me and help manage my grief. "How much money are we talking about?" I asked. Dr. Chen consulted her notes. "Based on what I've been able to trace so far, at least $230,000. But that's just what I can document through legitimate financial institutions. If your husband had cash savings or other assets that weren't formally banked, Michael could have taken substantially more, $230,000. I felt dizzy thinking about what that money could have meant for my children's future. College educations, a house they could grow up in without worrying about foreclosure, financial security that would have let me focus on raising them instead of working 60-hour weeks just to keep the lights on. Dr. Chen continued her explanation of Michael's fraud scheme, showing me how he'd used forged estate documents to gain access to accounts, how he'd created fake business expenses to justify large withdrawals, and how he'd systematically transferred money through multiple accounts to make it harder to trade. The most disturbing part was how he'd used my grief against me. Every conversation we'd had after Eddie's funeral, every piece of advice he'd given me about selling the house or filing for bankruptcy, had been designed to prevent me from looking too closely at the financial details while he continued stealing. But Michael had made mistakes, and Dr. Chen was methodical about identifying each one. He'd been overconfident about his ability to manipulate the situation, and his desperation about his own legal troubles had made him sloppy in places where a more careful criminal might have covered his tracks better. The forged signatures were the most obvious error. Michael had practiced Eddie's signature, but he'd relied too heavily on examples from old Christmas cards and birthday notes instead of studying Eddie's business signature, which was different and more complex. A handwriting expert would have no trouble proving that the estate documents were fraudulent. More damaging was the electronic trail Michael had left behind. He'd used his own computer and phone to research banking procedures, bankruptcy law, and asset protection strategy. His internet search history read like a manual for estate fraud, complete with queries about how long financial institutions kept records and what kind of documentation was required for large asset transfers. Dr. Chen had also discovered that Michael had been careless about the timing of his transactions. He'd liquidated one of Eddie's certificates of deposit on the same day he'd called me to express concern about my financial situation. The phone records showed that he'd called the bank first, authorized the transfer, and then called me an hour later to ask how I was coping with Eddie's debts. But the most damaging evidence was something that Michael probably didn't even realize existed. Eddie's Union Benefits office had recorded all phone conversations related to account changes, and Dr. Chen had obtained copies of the calls Michael had made, claiming to be Eddie's estate executive. In those recordings, Michael could be heard lying smoothly and confidently about Eddie's financial situation, claiming that the family was desperate and needed immediate access to the pension funds to pay for funeral expenses and outstanding debts. His voice was calm and professional, completely different from the concerned brother-in-law who had comforted me at the funeral. Listening to those recordings was like hearing someone plan the destruction of my family while speaking in my dead husband's voice. Michael sounded so confident, so entitled to money that belonged to my children. There was no hesitation in his voice, no apparent guilt about what he was doing. Dr. Chen warned me that recovering the stolen money would be complicated and potentially time-consuming. Michael had moved funds through multiple accounts, and some of the money had probably been used to pay his own debts or legal expenses. We might be able to trace the transfers and obtain court orders for restitution, but actually collecting the money could take years. She also explained that Michael would likely try to claim that he'd had legitimate reasons for his action. Estate executors did have broad authority to manage assets and pay debts, and Michael would probably argue that he'd been acting in good faith based on his understanding of Eddie's financial situation. It was a weak defense given the evidence of forged documents and deliberate deception, but it might be enough to reduce the criminal charges or create reasonable doubt in some people's minds. White-collar criminals often avoided serious consequences by claiming that complex financial transactions were just misunderstandings rather than deliberate fraud. But Dr. Chen was optimistic about our chances of success. The evidence was strong. Michael had been careless in several important ways, and his ongoing SESC investigation would make it harder for him to claim that he was a trustworthy person who had simply made honest mistakes. More importantly, the court was clearly taking the case seriously. Judge Morrison, who was overseeing the estate proceedings, had a reputation for being tough on financial fraud, especially when it involved vulnerable people like widows and children. Over the next few weeks, Dr. Chen's investigation uncovered even more evidence of Michael's deception. She found records showing that he'd been researching my background and financial situation for months before Eddie died, suggesting that he'd been planning his fraud scheme even while Eddie was still alive. She also discovered that Michael had attempted to forge documents giving him power of attorney over Eddie's medical decisions during what turned out to be Eddie's final hospital visit. The forgery had been unsuccessful because the hospital required additional verification, but it showed that Michael had been preparing to take control of Eddie's affairs even before Eddie was pronounced dead. Most disturbing was evidence that Michael had been in contact with several of Eddie's business clients, telling them that the family was disputing Eddie's final invoices and that they should hold off on making payments until the estate issues were resolved. He'd been actively preventing money from reaching us while simultaneously claiming that Eddie's business had been failing. Dr. Chen presented her preliminary findings to Judge Morrison in a closed hearing that I was allowed to attend but not participate in. Watching her methodically destroy Michael's lies with documentation and evidence was one of the most satisfying experiences I'd had since Eddie's death. Michael's lawyer, the sharp-dressed woman who had tried to intimidate me during the settlement negotiations, seemed overwhelmed by the scope of evidence against her client. She attempted to argue that Michael had been acting under extreme stress due to his own legal troubles, and that his mistakes had been errors in judgment rather than criminal fraud. Judge Morrison was not impressed. He pointed out that the forged signatures alone constituted multiple felonies, and that the systematic nature of Michael's deception suggested careful planning rather than panicked mistake. The judge ordered Michael to appear for a deposition within 2 weeks, and warned that failure to cooperate fully with Dr. Chen's investigation could result in additional charges and immediate arrest. He also expanded the asset freeze to include any personal accounts that Michael controlled, effectively preventing him from accessing any money until the investigation was complete. Walking out of the courthouse that day, I felt like justice was finally within reach. The legal system was slow and complicated, but it was working the way it was supposed to work. People who thought they could take advantage of grieving families were being held accountable for their actions. Marcus called me that evening to check on how the hearing had gone. He'd been following the case closely from Tennessee, and he'd been providing Dr. Chen with additional information about Michael's financial history and family relationships. "I think Michael is finally starting to understand that this isn't going to go away," Marcus said. His lawyer called my office yesterday asking if I'd be willing to testify about Michael's character and financial situation. I told her I'd be happy to testify, but probably not in the way she was hoping.
Marcus had decided to take a leave of absence from his job to help with the investigation and to provide support during the legal proceeding. His financial expertise was invaluable for understanding the complex asset transfers that Michael had orchestrated, and his personal knowledge of Michael's behavior patterns helped Dr. Chen anticipate what evidence to look for. But Marcus was also struggling with his own emotions about the situation. He'd grown up with Michael, and despite their differences over the years, he'd never imagined that his twin brother was capable of the kind of calculated cruelty that the investigation was revealing. "I keep thinking about Eddie," Marcus told me. "He trusted Michael enough to name him as executor in his original will. Eddie believed that Michael would take care of you and the kids if something happened to him. The betrayal goes so much deeper than just stealing money." I understood what Marcus meant. Michael hadn't just robbed us financially, he'd violated the most basic bonds of family loyalty and trust. He'd looked me in the eye at Eddie's funeral and promised to help us through our grief while he was actively planning to steal everything Eddie had worked to leave us. The impact on my children was something I worried about constantly. Kaylee had always been close to Uncle Michael, and learning that he'd been lying to us and stealing from us was confusing and hurtful for her. She started having nightmares and asking questions about whether other adults in her life might be lying to her too. Trevor dealt with the situation by withdrawing even further into himself. He stopped talking about his father almost entirely, and I could see him struggling with the idea that the family he'd trusted to support us after Eddie's death had actually been working against us. Stella was too young to understand the details, but she picked up on the tension and stress that dominated our household. She started having behavioral problems at school and clinging to me in ways that suggested she was worried about losing another important person in her life.
I arranged for all 3 kids to see a counselor who specialized in helping children cope with trauma and family disruption. Dr. Sarah Williams was a gentle, patient woman who helped the kids process their feelings about Eddie's death, Michael's betrayal, and the uncertainty about our family's future. Dr. Williams also helped me understand how the stress of the legal proceedings was affecting my own emotional state. I'd been so focused on fighting for justice and recovering the stolen money that I hadn't paid enough attention to my own grief and anger. "You're dealing with multiple losses," she explained during one of our sessions. "You lost your husband, which is devastating enough, but you also lost your sense of financial security, your trust in family relationships, and your confidence in your ability to protect your children. Those are all significant traumas that need to be processed." She was right. I'd been operating in crisis mode for so long that I'd forgotten how to think about anything except the immediate problems that needed to be solved. I hadn't allowed myself to properly mourn Eddie's death because I'd been too busy fighting to preserve what he'd left behind for us. Dr. Williams helped me develop strategies for managing the stress of the legal proceedings while still being emotionally available for my children. She also helped me understand that recovering the stolen money, while important, wouldn't magically solve all of our problems or erase the trauma that Michael's betrayal had caused. Meanwhile, Dr. Chen's investigation was moving forward with methodical precision. She'd been able to trace most of the stolen money through Michael's various accounts and transactions, and she'd identified several assets that could potentially be seized to satisfy restitution orders. Michael owned a house in an upscale subdivision that had substantial equity. He had investment accounts that contained money that could be traced directly to Eddie's estate. He even owned a boat and 2 luxury cars that had been purchased with funds that Dr. Chen could prove had been stolen from us. But Michael was fighting every aspect of the investigation. His lawyer was filing motion after motion, attempting to block Dr. Chen's access to his financial records, claiming that the investigation was a violation of his privacy rights and that the evidence against him was circumstantial. The legal maneuvering was frustrating and time-consuming, but Patricia assured me that it was also a sign that Michael was desperate. People who were confident in their innocence didn't usually try so hard to prevent investigators from examining their financial record. Michael's deposition was scheduled for a Thursday morning in Patricia's conference room. I was allowed to attend as a witness, and Marcus drove up from Tennessee to provide moral support and additional testimony if needed. Seeing Michael again after weeks of learning about the scope of his deception was surreal. He looked older and more haggard than he had at the settlement meeting, and his expensive clothes couldn't hide the fact that he was under enormous stress. His lawyer had clearly coached him to say as little as possible. Michael answered most questions with variations of "I don't recall," or "I'd have to review my record." When pressed for details about specific transactions, he claimed that he'd been acting on advice from lawyers and accountants who had told him that his actions were appropriate. But Dr. Chen was relentless in her questioning. She had documented every transaction, every forged signature, every false statement that Michael had made to financial institutions. When she presented him with evidence of his crimes, his carefully rehearsed answers started to fall apart. The most damaging moment came when Dr. Chen played recordings of Michael's phone calls to Eddie's union benefits office. Hearing his voice confidently lying about our family's financial desperation while he was stealing money that belonged to us was devastating even for his own lawyer. Michael's face went pale as he listened to himself claim that Eddie had died owing substantial debts, and that the family needed immediate access to pension funds to avoid losing our home. The contrast between his smooth, professional tone on the recordings and his current nervous, evasive demeanor was striking. When Dr. Chen asked him to explain the discrepancy between his recorded statements and the actual evidence about Eddie's financial situation, Michael finally lost his composure. "I was trying to help," he said, his voice cracking with what might have been emotion or might have been calculated performance. "Zelma was overwhelmed, and I thought it would be easier for everyone if I handled the complicated financial details. I may have made some mistakes, but everything I did was intended to protect the family." Doc Chen asked him to explain how stealing over $200,000 from his dead brother's children constituted protecting the family. Michael's lawyer objected to the characterization, but the damage was done. Michael had essentially admitted to taking money while claiming that he'd done it for our benefit. The deposition continued for over 4 hours, and by the end, Michael looked like a broken man. He'd been forced to confront the evidence of his systematic fraud, and his attempts to justify his actions had only made him look more guilty. Patricia told me afterward that Michael's performance had been a disaster for his case. He'd contradicted himself multiple times, admitted to actions that constituted criminal fraud, and failed to provide any credible explanation for the forged documents and false statement. More importantly, the deposition had been recorded and would be admissible in any criminal proceedings that might follow. Michael had essentially confessed to multiple felonies while under oath, making it much harder for him to claim innocence if the case went to trial. 2 days after the deposition, Michael's lawyer called Patricia to request another settlement meeting. This time they were offering full restitution, plus additional damages, along with Michael's resignation as executor and a formal apology for the errors in handling the estate. It was a much better offer than the lowball settlement they'd proposed initially, but it still came with no admission of criminal wrongdoing. Michael wanted to frame his theft as civil matter, a series of mistakes that could be resolved with financial compensation. Patricia and I discussed the offer carefully. Full restitution would solve our immediate financial problems and provide the security that Eddie had wanted us to have. Accepting the settlement would also allow us to avoid the uncertainty and expense of a lengthy trial, but the offer didn't include any accountability for the emotional trauma that Michael had caused or any recognition of the criminal nature of his actions. It was essentially an attempt to buy his way out of consequences for behavior that had devastated our family. I thought about my children and what kind of message it would send if we allowed Michael to escape responsibility for his crimes just because he was finally willing to return the money he'd stolen. I thought about other families who might be victimized by similar fraud if people like Michael learned that they could avoid serious consequences by offering restitution after they were caught. Most of all, I thought about Eddie and what he would have wanted. Eddie had always believed in doing the right thing even when it was difficult or costly. He'd raised our children to understand that actions have consequences, and that people who hurt others should be held accountable for their behavior. I told Patricia to reject the settlement offer. If Michael wanted to return the stolen money, he could do so as part of a criminal plea agreement that included appropriate punishment for his crimes. But we weren't going to let him buy his way out of accountability for what he'd done to our family. Patricia warned me that refusing the settlement meant that we'd have to continue fighting through the criminal proceedings, which could take months or even years to resolve. There was also no guarantee that we'd ultimately recover more money through the criminal process than Michael was offering to pay voluntarily. I understood the risks, but I'd made my decision. Michael had counted on our grief and desperation to prevent us from fighting back when he was stealing from us. He was still counting on our desire for financial security to prevent us from holding him accountable for his crime. But he'd underestimated our determination to see justice done, and he'd underestimated the strength that came from finally understanding the truth about what had happened to our family. The criminal charges were filed the following week. Michael was indicted on multiple counts of estate fraud, forgery, and theft, along with federal charges related to his securities violations. The combined charges carried potential prison sentences of up to 15 years. Local media picked up the story, and for a few days our situation became a cautionary tale about the importance of carefully choosing estate executors and monitoring the handling of family finances. I was uncomfortable with the public attention, but I was also glad that other families might learn from our experience and be better prepared to protect themselves. Michael's arrest was scheduled for a Monday morning, and Marcus offered to drive me to the courthouse so I could see him taken into custody. I declined, not because I didn't want to see justice done, but because I was finally ready to focus on rebuilding our lives rather than watching Michael face the consequences of his choices. Dr. Trin's investigation had identified enough assets to cover full restitution, and the court had ordered those assets to be liquidated and transferred to an account controlled by the estate administrator. Within a few weeks, we'd have access to the money that Eddie had actually left for us, plus additional funds to compensate for the damage that Michael's theft had caused. More importantly, we'd have the truth. My children would grow up knowing that their father had been a responsible man who'd worked hard to provide for their future. They'd understand that the financial crisis we'd faced after his death wasn't because Eddie had failed as a provider, but because someone they'd trusted had betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. The house was no longer in danger of foreclosure. The kids could stay in their schools and maintain the friendships and stability they needed. I could reduce my work hours and be more present for them as they processed their grief and adjusted to life without their father. But perhaps most importantly, we'd learned that we were stronger than we'd realized. We'd faced a devastating betrayal and had fought back successfully. We'd stood up to someone who'd thought he could take advantage of our vulnerability, and we'd proven that justice was possible even when the system seemed stacked against us. Sitting in our living room that evening, watching my children do homework at the table where we'd once sorted through bills we couldn't pay, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Eddie's death. Hope, not just for financial security, but for the kind of future that Eddie had wanted us to have. A future built on truth, supported by the resources Eddie had worked to provide, and strengthened by our own courage in fighting for what was right. The criminal trial began on a crisp October morning exactly 11 months after Eddie's death. The courthouse was smaller than I'd expected, with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look pale and tired. I sat in the front row behind the prosecutor's table, flanked by Marcus on one side and Patricia on the other, watching as the jury was selected to decide Michael's fate. District Attorney Rebecca Martinez had taken personal interest in the case, explaining to me that estate fraud targeting grieving families was a particular concern in our county. She was a compact woman with silver-streaked hair and the kind of intense focus that suggested she'd prosecuted hundreds of criminals who thought they were smarter than the law. The defense attorney was a different person than the sharp-dressed woman who had represented Michael during the civil proceedings. James Kellerman was older, with the gravelly voice and rumpled appearance of someone who specialized in hopeless cases. His strategy became clear during opening statements. He was going to paint Michael as a man who had made poor decisions under extreme stress rather than a calculating criminal who had systematically defrauded his brother's estate. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Kellerman began, This case is about a family tragedy that spiraled out of control. My client Michael Brooks was facing his own financial crisis when his beloved brother Eddie died suddenly and unexpectedly. In his grief and desperation, he made some questionable decisions about how to handle the estate, but poor judgment is not the same as criminal intent. Dia Martinez's opening statement was more direct. She stood in front of the jury box and methodically outlined the evidence they would see over the coming days: bank records showing systematic theft, forged documents with Michael's fingerprints, recorded phone calls where Michael lied to financial institutions, a clear pattern of deception that began before Eddie was even buried and continued for months. "This is not a case about grief or poor judgment," Martinez said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen every possible variation of white-collar crime. "This is a case about a man who saw his brother's death as an opportunity to solve his own financial problems. The defendant didn't just steal money from his brother's widow and children, he stole their future, their security, and their trust in family bonds that should have been sacred." The first week of testimony focused on establishing the timeline of Michael's fraud and the methods he had used to access Eddie's accounts. Dr. Nguyen took the stand for 2 full days, walking the jury through her forensic analysis of the financial records with the kind of methodical detail that left no room for doubt about what had happened. She showed the jury copies of the forged documents, explained the sophisticated techniques Michael had used to practice Eddie's signature, and demonstrated how he had used multiple bank accounts to launder the stolen money and make it harder to trace. Her testimony was devastating because it removed any possibility that Michael's actions had been impulsive or accidental. The prosecution also called several of Eddie's former clients to testify about the checks they had sent to his business address after his death. These were honest working people who had wanted to make sure Eddie's family received the money owed for completed work. Hearing them describe their shock at learning that their payments had been intercepted by Michael was emotionally powerful for the jury. Tony Castellano from the restaurant was particularly effective as a witness. He explained how he had specifically requested certified mail for his final payment to Eddie, because he wanted to make sure a grieving widow wouldn't have to chase down money during such a difficult time. When Dia Martinez asked him how he felt upon learning that Michael had stolen that payment, Tony's voice broke slightly. "I trusted him because he was Eddie's brother," Tony said. "Eddie always talked about family loyalty, about how important it was to take care of each other. I thought I was helping his family by sending that money promptly. Finding out that his own brother was stealing from his wife and kids, it made me sick to my stomach." Marcus's testimony was scheduled for the second week of the trial. He had been dreading this moment since the criminal charges were filed, knowing that he would have to testify against his twin brother in front of a courtroom full of strangers. But when Dia Martinez called his name, Marcus walked to the witness stand with the composed determination of someone who had chosen justice over family loyalty. The prosecutor led Marcus through his background and his relationship with both Eddie and Mike. She had him explain the phone calls he'd received from Eddie about setting up protected investment accounts, and the later conversations with Michael where Michael had lied about the estate's financial situation. But the most damaging part of Marcus's testimony involved the text messages and emails he'd received from Michael over the past 2 years. Dia Martinez displayed these communications on screens around the courtroom, showing the jury a clear pattern of Michael lying to family members about his financial situation and borrowing money under false pretenses. In one particularly damning email, Michael had told Marcus that he needed $20,000 for emergency medical expenses for a girlfriend who didn't actually exist. In another, he had claimed that a business investment had fallen through and that he needed a short-term loan to avoid bankruptcy. Every story was a lie, every request part of a pattern of deception that had culminated in the theft from Eddie's estate. Defense attorney Kellerman tried to shake Marcus during cross-examination, suggesting that he was biased against Michael due to old family rivalries and that his testimony was motivated by a desire to inherit a larger share of Eddie's estate. But Marcus remained calm and factual, acknowledging that he and Michael had had their differences while standing firm on the evidence of Michael's fraudulent behavior. "The truth is," Marcus said at one point,
I would have helped Michael if he had been honest about his financial problem. Our family has always supported each other through difficult times, but Michael chose to lie and steal instead of asking for help. He chose to victimize Eddie's widow and children instead of facing his own mistakes honestly. The third week of the trial focused on the impact of Michael's crimes on our family. I had been nervous about testifying, worried that I might break down on the stand or say something that would hurt our case. But when Dia Martinez called my name, I found that I was ready to tell our story. I walked the jury through the timeline of events from Eddie's death through the discovery of Michael's fraud. I described the phone calls from creditors, the confusion about insurance policies that should have existed, the gradual realization that nothing about our financial situation was what it appeared to be. But I also talked about the emotional impact of Michael's betrayal. The way he had comforted me at Eddie's funeral while planning to steal from us. The nights I had lain awake wondering how I was going to feed my children or keep our home. The guilt I had felt for months, thinking that Eddie had somehow failed as a provider when the truth was that Michael had systematically stolen everything Eddie had worked to leave us. When Dia Martinez asked me to describe how Michael's actions had affected my children, I had to pause for a moment to collect myself. Kaylee had trusted Uncle Michael completely. She had turned to him for comfort after her father's death, and learning that he had been lying to us and stealing from us had shattered her faith in adults who claimed to care about her. Trevor had become withdrawn and suspicious, questioning whether other family members might also be lying to him. Stella had started having nightmares about losing our house, fears that had been entirely justified given that Michael's theft had nearly resulted in foreclosure. These children lost their father, I told the jury, my voice stronger than I had expected it to be, but they also lost their sense of security, their trust in family relationships, and their faith that adults would protect them rather than prey on them. Michael didn't just steal money, he stole their childhood innocence and their belief that family members would take care of each other. Kellerman's cross-examination was gentler than I had expected. He seemed to recognize that attacking a grieving widow would backfire with the jury, so he focused on trying to establish that I had been confused and overwhelmed after Eddie's death, and that I might have misunderstood Michael's intention. But I had been preparing for this line of questioning for months. I calmly walked through the evidence that proved Michael's deception, from the forged signatures, to the recorded phone calls, to the systematic liquidation of assets. I acknowledged that I had been grieving and overwhelmed, but I pointed out that grief doesn't make you unable to recognize theft when it's happening to you. The most powerful moment of my testimony came when Kellerman asked whether I thought Michael might have genuinely believed he was helping our family by managing the estate finances. I looked directly at the jury and gave them an answer I had been thinking about for months. A person who genuinely wants to help a grieving family doesn't forge documents, I said. They don't lie to banks and insurance companies. They don't intercept checks that belong to someone else, and they certainly don't manufacture fake debts to cover up their theft. Michael knew exactly what he was doing, and he did it anyway because he thought I was too weak and too trusting to stop him. The prosecution's final witnesses were experts who testified about the psychological impact of financial fraud on families, and the sophisticated nature of Michael's criminal scheme. A forensic psychologist explained how perpetrators of family fraud often exploit the grief and vulnerability of their victims, using emotional manipulation to prevent their crimes from being discovered. Dr. Chen returned to the stand to provide additional details about the money trail, and to explain how Michael's asset transfers violated multiple federal and state laws. Her testimony was technical but devastating, leaving no doubt that Michael had committed serious felonies that deserved significant punishment. When the prosecution rested its case, I felt like we had presented overwhelming evidence of Michael's guilt. But I also knew that Kellerman was an experienced defense attorney who would try to create reasonable doubt by focusing on Michael's personal circumstances and psychological state. The defense case began with character witnesses who testified about Michael's previous good reputation and his history of helping family members in crisis. His former colleagues described him as professional and trustworthy, while neighbors talked about his volunteer work and community involvement. But these testimonials felt hollow in the face of the evidence against Michael. Dia Martinez's cross-examinations, effectively established that none of these witnesses had been aware of Michael's financial problems or his history of lying to family members about money. Michael's ex-wife was called as a defense witness, and her testimony backfired spectacularly. Kellerman had apparently hoped she would testify about the stress Michael had been under due to his SEC investigation and his mounting debt. Instead, she revealed additional examples of Michael's dishonest financial behavior during their marriage. She described how Michael had hidden investments from her, lied about the family's financial situation, and used joint credit cards for personal expenses without her knowledge. Her testimony painted a picture of someone with a long history of financial deception, completely undermining the defense argument that Michael's crimes had been aberrant behavior caused by grief and desperation. The defense also called a psychiatrist who testified that Michael was suffering from depression and anxiety that had impaired his judgment during the months after Eddie's death. But Dia Martinez's cross-examination revealed that the psychiatrist had only examined Michael recently and had no first-hand knowledge of his mental state during the time period when the crimes were committed. More damaging, the psychiatrist admitted that depression and anxiety were common conditions that didn't typically cause people to forge documents or systematically steal from family members. His testimony actually supported the prosecution's argument that Michael's actions had been calculated and intentional rather than impulsive reactions to emotional distress. The moment everyone had been waiting for came during the fourth week of the trial when Kellerman announced that Michael would testify in his own defense. This was a risky strategy that suggested the defense team was desperate to humanize their client and provide some explanation for his behavior that might resonate with the jury. Michael took the stand wearing a conservative suit and the kind of subdued demeanor that defense attorneys coach clients to adopt when they're facing serious criminal charges. But when he began speaking, it became clear that his testimony was going to be a disaster for his case. Kellerman led Michael through his background and his relationship with Eddie, trying to establish the close family bonds that Michael had violated through his crime. Michael described growing up as an adopted child in the Brooks family and the gratitude he felt for being taken in after his parents' death. But when the questioning turned to the events after Eddie's death, Michael's answers became evasive and contradictory. He claimed that he had been acting in good faith based on his understanding of estate law and his belief that the family needed immediate financial help. When confronted with specific evidence of his fraud, Michael offered explanations that were obviously false or incomplete. He claimed that he had forged Eddie's signature on documents because he thought that's what Eddie would have wanted him to do. He insisted that he had moved money between accounts to protect it from creditors, not to steal it for his own use. Most damaging was Michael's complete inability to explain where the stolen money had gone. When Kellerman asked him to account for the funds he had taken from the estate, Michael claimed that most of the money had been used to pay Eddie's debts and estate expenses, but he couldn't provide any documentation showing what those expenses were or which debts had been paid. Dia Martinez's cross-examination was methodical and devastating.
She walked Michael through each forged document, each false statement to a financial institution, each transfer of money to accounts he controlled. For every lie, she had documentation that proved Michael knew exactly what he was doing. The most powerful moment came when Martinez played the recordings of Michael's phone calls to Eddie's union benefits office. She had Michael listen to his own voice, confidently lying about our family's financial desperation, while she simultaneously displayed bank records showing that he was transferring Eddie's money to his own accounts. "How do you explain this discrepancy, Mr. Brooks?" Martinez asked, her voice cutting through the courtroom silence. Michael stared at the documents for a long moment before giving an answer that sealed his fate. "I was trying to help the family," he said, weakly. "Sometimes helping people requires making difficult decisions that they might not understand at the time." Martinez pressed him on this response. "So, your testimony is that stealing over $200,000 from your brother's widow and children was actually a way of helping them." Michael's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. Michael had essentially admitted that he had taken the money while claiming that theft was somehow beneficial to his victims. It was exactly the kind of entitled, self-serving rationalization that juries hate to hear from defendants. The remainder of Michael's cross-examination was equally damaging. Martinez got him to admit that he had never told me about the assets he was liquidating, that he had deliberately misled financial institutions about the family's situation, and that he had used some of the stolen money to pay his own personal debt. By the time Michael stepped down from the witness stand, he looked like a Reuben man. His testimony had confirmed every aspect of the prosecution's case, while providing no credible explanation for his criminal behavior. Closing arguments began the following Monday. Kellerman made a final attempt to portray Michael as a man who had made poor decisions under extreme stress, arguing that his crimes deserved compassion rather than harsh punishment. He asked the jury to consider Michael's previously clean record and his contributions to the community. But DA Martinez's closing argument was devastating in its simplicity and power. She reminded the jury of the evidence they had seen and heard over the past 4 weeks. The forged documents with Michael's fingerprints. The recorded phone calls where he lied about our family's financial situation. The systematic movement of money from Eddie's accounts to accounts controlled by Michael. This defendant looked his brother's widow in the eye at a funeral and promised to take care of everything. Martinez said, her voice carrying the weight of moral authority, and then he went home and began planning how to steal everything her husband had worked to leave for his children. That's not poor judgment under stress. That's calculated criminal behavior that deserves the full punishment of the law. She reminded the jury that Michael's crimes had impact beyond just financial loss. 3 children had been robbed of their father's legacy and their faith in family relationships. A grieving widow had been manipulated and deceived during the most vulnerable period of her life. When you deliberate, Martinez concluded, I want you to remember that justice isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about protecting future victims from people who think they can prey on grieving families without consequence. Michael Brooks chose to be a predator when he should have been a protector. Your verdict will determine whether that choice has consequences. The jury deliberated for just over 6 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. Michael showed no emotion as the foreman read each verdict. But I could see his shoulders sagging as the weight of his convictions settled on him. Judge Morrison scheduled sentencing for the following month, and Michael was remanded to custody pending the hearing. As the bailiff led him away in handcuffs, Michael looked back at me once with an expression I couldn't quite read. It might have been regret, or it might have been anger that his plan had failed. The weeks between the conviction and sentencing gave me time to think about what justice actually meant in our situation. Michael would likely face several years in prison, and the court had ordered full restitution of the stolen funds, plus additional damages. Our family's financial security had been restored, and Michael would face consequences for his crimes. But I also knew that some of the damage Michael had caused couldn't be repaired with money or prison sentences. My children's trust in family relationships had been shattered in ways that would take years to heal. The stress and uncertainty of the past year had taken a toll on all of us that wouldn't disappear just because justice had been done. Dr. Williams, the family counselor, helped me understand that healing would be a long process that went beyond the resolution of the criminal case. The trauma of betrayal runs deep, especially when it comes from someone who was supposed to protect and support you. But she also helped me recognize the strength that our family had shown throughout the ordeal. We had faced devastating betrayal and had fought back successfully. We had refused to be victims and had insisted on accountability even when it would have been easier to accept a settlement and move on. Most importantly, we had learned that we could trust ourselves to recognize when something was wrong and to take action to protect our interests. The confidence that came from that knowledge would serve us well in whatever challenges we faced in the future. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for a gray December morning almost exactly a year after Eddie's death. The courtroom was fuller than it had been during the trial, with local media covering the conclusion of a case that had garnered significant public attention. Judge Morrison heard victim impact statements from me and Marcus before pronouncing sentence. I had prepared written remarks, but when my turn came to speak, I found myself setting aside my notes and speaking directly from my heart. Your Honor, I said, standing at the podium and looking directly at Michael for the first time since his conviction, This case has never been about revenge or punishment for its own sake. It's been about accountability and justice for someone who violated the most basic bonds of family trust. I told the judge about the sleepless nights I had spent wondering how I was going to provide for my children, not knowing that Michael was stealing the money Eddie had saved for exactly that purpose. I described the guilt I had felt for months, thinking that Eddie had somehow failed as a provider, when the truth was that Michael had systematically stolen everything Eddie had worked to leave us. But I also talked about the broader implications of Michael's crime. How many other grieving families might be victimized by similar fraud if people learned that the consequences were minimal? How many other people in positions of trust might be tempted to abuse that trust if they saw that Michael had escaped serious punishment? Michael stole our money, I said, but he also stole something more precious. He stole our children's faith that family members would protect them rather than prey on them. He stole our sense of security and our trust in the people who claim to care about us. Those losses can't be repaired with restitution, but they can be acknowledged with appropriate punishment. Judge Morrison listened carefully to the victim impact statements and to the defense attorney's plea for leniency based on Michael's lack of prior criminal record and his cooperation with the restitution process. But when he announced his sentence, it was clear that he understood the seriousness of Michael's crimes and their impact on our family. Mr. Brooks, the judge said, looking directly at the defendant, you held a position of trust as your brother's executor, and you violated that trust in the most calculated and devastating way possible. You didn't just steal money, you stole from grieving children and their mother during the most vulnerable period of their lives. The judge sentenced Michael to 8 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 6 years. He also ordered full restitution of the stolen funds, plus additional damages for the emotional and financial harm caused by the extended legal proceeding. It was a substantial sentence that reflected the seriousness of Michael's crimes, while still allowing for the possibility of redemption if he served his time and made genuine efforts to make amends for what he had done. Walking out of the courthouse that day, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't experienced since Eddie's death. Justice had been done, our financial security had been restored, and the legal proceedings that had dominated our lives for the past year were finally over. But more importantly, I felt proud of the choice we had made to fight for what was right rather than accepting Michael's deception and manipulation. My children had learned that actions have consequences and that people who hurt others can be held accountable for their behavior. They had also learned that their mother was stronger than they had realized and that our family could survive devastating betrayal and emerge stronger on the other side. Those were lessons that would serve them well throughout their lives. Long after the pain of Michael's betrayal had faded into memory, Marcus drove us home from the courthouse and we spent the evening talking about Eddie and the kind of man he had been. For the first time since his death, we were able to remember him without the shadow of financial worry and family betrayal clouding our memories. Eddie had been a good man who had worked hard to provide for his family's future. His legacy wasn't the financial crisis that Michael had created through his theft. His legacy was the security he had actually provided for us and the values he had taught our children about the importance of honesty, hard work, and taking care of the people you love. That night, I sat in our living room surrounded by my children and felt something I hadn't experienced since Eddie's death. Peace. Not just the absence of crisis, but the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've fought for what was right and won. 2 years have passed since Michael's sentencing, and our lives have settled into a rhythm that feels both familiar and entirely new. The restored financial security has given us breathing room that I never fully appreciated when Eddie was alive. But more importantly, we've rebuilt our family foundation on truth, rather than the illusions that Michael's deception had created. The house feels different now, not because we've made dramatic changes to the physical space, but because the constant undercurrent of financial anxiety has been replaced by genuine stability. Kaylee, now 16, has thrown herself into her studies with the confidence of someone who knows college is a realistic possibility rather than an impossible dream. She's been accepted into the advanced placement program at her high school and talks about becoming a lawyer herself someday, inspired by watching Patricia and D.A. Martinez fight for our family's rights. Trevor, who spent months withdrawn and suspicious after learning about Michael's betrayal, has gradually returned to his more open personality. He's 14 now and has found his passion in robotics and computer programming, skills that seem to give him a sense of control and predictability that was missing from his life during the chaos of the legal proceeding. He still asks pointed questions about family finances and wants to understand how money works, but his interest comes from curiosity rather than fear. Stella, at 10 years old, remembers the hardest parts of our ordeal as a time when Mommy was very busy with important papers, but she's grown up with the security that Eddie had always intended her to have. She's involved in dance classes and art programs that we couldn't afford during the months when Michael was systematically stealing from us, and she has the carefree confidence that comes from never doubting that her basic needs will be met. Williams continues to work with our family, though our sessions are now monthly check-ins, rather than weekly crisis management meetings. She's helped us process not just the trauma of Michael's betrayal, but also the complex emotions that come with successfully fighting back against someone who hurt us. There's satisfaction in knowing that justice was done, but there's also the ongoing work of rebuilding trust and managing the hypervigilance that develops when someone close to you proves capable of devastating deception. The financial restitution process took nearly 18 months to complete, partly because Michael had moved money through so many different accounts and investments. Chain's forensic investigation ultimately traced funds that even we hadn't known existed, including several small investment accounts that Eddie had set up through automatic payroll deductions over the year. The total recovery ended up being almost $300,000, significantly more than we had initially estimated. Some of this was money that Michael had stolen and hidden, but some represented interest and penalties that the court had ordered him to pay for the emotional and financial damage his crimes had caused our family. Marcus has become a regular presence in our lives, visiting every few months and maintaining the kind of relationship with my children that Eddie had probably hoped Michael would have. Unlike Michael's calculated helpfulness, Marcus's support feels genuine and unconditional. He's taught Trevor about investing and financial planning, helped Kaylee with college preparation, and become the kind of uncle figure that provides stability without trying to replace their father's memory. More importantly, Marcus has never tried to minimize or excuse Michael's behavior. He's been honest with the children about the fact that Michael made terrible choices that hurt people he should have protected, but he's also helped them understand that Michael's actions don't reflect on the rest of their family or diminish the love that Eddie had for them. The relationship between Marcus and me has evolved into something that feels like genuine family in a way that my relationship with Michael never did, even before we discovered his deception. There's no romantic element to our connection, but there's a deep mutual respect and shared commitment to honoring Eddie's memory by taking care of the family he loved. Marcus has been invaluable in helping me navigate the financial decisions that come with having substantial assets for the first time in my life. Eddie had worked hard and saved diligently, but he'd never had the kind of money that required professional investment management. Learning how to be responsible for my children's financial future has been both empowering and intimidating. We've been conservative with the recovered funds, putting most of the money into education savings accounts for the children and long-term investments that will provide security without requiring me to become a day trader or financial expert. The goal is to preserve what Eddie built while ensuring that the children will have opportunities he could only dream of provide. I've also been able to reduce my work hours at the hospital, shifting from full-time night security to part-time weekend shifts that allow me to be more present for school events and daily life with the children. The financial breathing room has given me something more valuable than money: time to be the mother I wanted to be rather than the exhausted single parent who was always scrambling to pay bills. The legal proceedings against Michael concluded with his imprisonment, but the broader impact of our case has continued to resonate in ways I never expected. Dan Martinez has used our case as a model for prosecuting estate fraud, and several other families have reached out to share their own experiences with similar crimes. It turns out that what happened to us wasn't as unusual as I had initially thought. Elder abuse and estate fraud are significant problems that often go unreported because families are too overwhelmed by grief to recognize what's happening until it's too late. Our willingness to fight back and pursue criminal charges has encouraged other victims to come forward and seek justice for similar betrayals.
Patricia has also seen an increase in clients who want to take preventive measures to protect their estates from potential fraud. She's developed educational materials about warning signs and protective strategies, using our experience as a case study and how quickly trusted family members can abuse their authority if proper safeguards aren't in place. The media attention from Michael's trial and conviction led to speaking opportunities that I initially declined but eventually embraced. I've spoken at legal conferences and community organizations about recognizing and responding to estate fraud, always emphasizing that victims shouldn't feel ashamed about being deceived by people they trust. These speaking engagements have been emotionally challenging but also therapeutic in ways I didn't expect. Telling our story to audiences who can learn from our experience has given meaning to the trauma we endured, and has helped me process my own feelings about what happened to our family. Michael's imprisonment has been a distant reality for us rather than something we think about regularly. He was transferred to a federal facility about 4 hours away, and we've had no contact with him since his sentence. He'll be eligible for parole in about 4 more years, but his release won't change our lives significantly since we've rebuilt our security and moved forward without any dependence on him. I've occasionally wondered whether Michael has used his time in prison to reflect on his choices and develop genuine remorse for what he did to our family, but I've learned that my healing doesn't depend on his redemption or acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Justice was served through the legal system, and our recovery has come through our own efforts rather than anything Michael might do or say. The children have different perspectives on Michael's. Kaylee feels that his sentence was appropriate, and talks about the importance of accountability for people who abuse positions of trust. Trevor is more focused on understanding how the financial fraud worked than on the emotional aspects of Michael's betrayal. Stella remembers Uncle Michael as someone who was around for a while and then wasn't, without much emotional investment in what happened to him. Dr. Williams has helped us understand that these different reactions are all healthy ways of processing a complex family trauma. The children don't need to forgive Michael or maintain relationships with him, but they also don't need to carry anger or resentment that would interfere with their own emotional development. Eddie's memory has been restored to its rightful place in our family narrative, instead of the confusion and guilt that dominated the months after his death. When I wondered whether he had somehow failed as a provider, the children now understand that their father was a responsible man who worked hard to secure their future. We've created new traditions for remembering Eddie that focus on his values and character rather than the circumstances of his death. Every year on his birthday, we volunteer at a local charity that helps families facing financial crisis. On the anniversary of his death, we visit his grave not with sadness for what was lost, but with gratitude for what he was able to provide for us. The children talk about their father with pride and affection, sharing memories that keep his presence alive in our daily life. They understand that he would be proud of how we fought for the truth and refused to be victims of Michael's deception. Looking back on the entire ordeal, I'm struck by how much I underestimated my own strength and resourcefulness during those first months after Eddie's death. I accepted Michael's version of events partly because I was overwhelmed by grief, but also because I had internalized the idea that I wasn't capable of understanding complicated financial matters, or challenging authority figures who claimed to be helping me. The experience of investigating Michael's fraud and fighting for justice taught me that I was much more capable than I had realized. I could understand complex financial documents when I took the time to study them. I could ask pointed questions and demand honest answers. I could stand up to intimidation and manipulation when my family's welfare was at stake. These discoveries about my own capabilities have influenced other areas of my life as well. I've become more assertive in advocating for my children's educational needs, more confident in making major financial decisions, and more willing to trust my instincts when something doesn't feel right. The children have also learned important lessons about resilience and the power of standing up for what's right. They've seen that justice is possible even when the odds seem overwhelming, and they've learned that families can survive devastating betrayals if they support each other and refuse to give up. Kaylee often talks about wanting to help other families who have been victimized by financial fraud. Her interest in becoming a lawyer seems motivated not just by academic curiosity, but by a genuine desire to fight for people who have been taken advantage of by those in positions of trust. Trevor's fascination with technology and systems has been shaped partly by his experience watching Dr. Chen trace Michael's financial crimes through electronic records. He talks about wanting to develop better tools for detecting fraud and protecting people from financial predators. Even Stella, despite being young during the worst of our crisis, has absorbed lessons about the importance of honesty and standing up for family members who need help. She's more aware than most children her age of the fact that not all adults can be trusted, but she's also learned that there are good people who will fight for what's right when it matters. The house that we nearly lost to foreclosure has become a symbol of our family's resilience rather than a reminder of our vulnerability. We've made some improvements with the recovered funds, but more importantly, it's become a place where we feel genuinely secure rather than constantly worried about financial disaster. My relationship with money has evolved significantly since the early days when I was overwhelmed by bills I couldn't pay and debts I didn't understand. I've learned enough about financial management to make informed decisions about investments and planning, but I've also maintained the healthy skepticism that comes from discovering how easily trusted family members can abuse their authority. We work with a fee-only financial advisor who has no incentive to sell us products we don't need, and I've learned to ask detailed questions about any financial recommendation. The children are growing up with much better financial literacy than I had at their age, understanding how money works and how to protect themselves from people who might try to take advantage of them. The legal fees from our case were substantial, but they were ultimately covered by the restitution that Michael was ordered to pay. Patricia's decision to work on a contingency basis meant that we weren't financially destroyed by the cost of seeking justice, and the successful outcome validated our decision to fight rather than accept a quick settlement. Marcus has helped me understand the broader implications of estate planning and asset protection. We've set up trusts and legal structures that would make it much harder for anyone to manipulate or steal from the children's inheritance if something were to happen to me. The goal is to ensure that they'll never face the kind of vulnerability and confusion that made us targets for Michael's fraud. These protective measures include detailed documentation of all assets, multiple oversight mechanisms for anyone who might need to act as executor or trustee, and clear instructions for the children about how to verify information and seek independent advice if they're ever uncertain about financial matters. But perhaps the most important protection we've put in place is the knowledge and confidence that comes from having successfully fought back against financial predators. The children understand that they have the right to ask questions, demand documentation, and seek independent verification of anything that affects their financial security. Our experience has also strengthened our connections with extended family members who proved trustworthy during our crisis. Several of Eddie's cousins and colleagues provided emotional support and practical help during the worst months, and those relationships have deepened into lasting friendships that provide additional security for the children. We've learned to distinguish between people who offer help because they genuinely care about our welfare and people who are positioning themselves to take advantage of us. The difference isn't always obvious initially, but patterns of behavior over time reveal whether someone's concern is authentic or self-serving. The community response to our case has been overwhelmingly supportive. Local businesses and organizations have reached out to offer assistance and to express admiration for our willingness to seek justice despite the personal and financial costs involved. Some of this support has taken practical forms, like discounted legal services,